What's your worst experience with the healthcare system? When my wife was pregnant with our twin boys, the doctors somehow missed her pulmonary hypertension, a heart condition that kills 30% of mothers in labor. We didn't even know she had it till she gave birth 12 weeks early and ended up in a coma. Even worse, when our boys came out, they were blue in the face and needed the NICU immediately for any chance of survival. But apparently, the hospital couldn't put them in the NICU. They needed insurance authorization from our providers before saving their lives. I told her that would take days and my boys were literally purple, but the woman just sighed. I'm sorry, but rules are rules. Without authorization, we're talking about a $400,000 bill you'd be personally liable for, she said, not even looking at my twins. I could hear the heart monitors going crazy. Please, I begged, dropping to my knees. Look at them. Look at them. They're dying. She glanced over for half a second. Sir, getting emotional won't change protocol. I suggest you call your insurance company. I fumbled with my phone, hands shaking so bad I could barely dial. The insurance company put me on hold, while my babies were turning darker blue. 20 minutes of that cheerful hold music while I watched my son Lucas's heart rate drop from 180 to 140 to 110. The administrator, Mrs. Miles, was at her desk eating a sandwich. I ran over, phone still on hold. Please, just start the treatment. I'll pay cash, I'll sell my house, I'll sign anything. Sir, even if you had $400,000 cash right now, we can't accept it without going through insurance first. It's fraud prevention protocol. She took another bite of her sandwich. A young nurse finally broke. Mrs. Miles, those babies have maybe an hour. Jennifer, you're already on probation. One more word, and you're fired. The nurse shut up, but she was sobbing. Other parents in the waiting room were recording on their phones, horrified. One dad stood up and said, Lady, what is wrong with you? Mrs. Miles called security. I need these disruptive individuals removed from the admin area. I ran back to my boys. Ethan wasn't moving anymore. The resident doctor, Dr. Kim, was manually pumping air into his lungs with a bag. I'm buying you time, he whispered. But I can't do the procedures they need. I could lose my license. Insurance finally answered. The representative said they needed to review the case. It's Saturday, sir. Our medical review board doesn't meet until Monday. Monday? I screamed. They'll be dead by Monday. I understand your frustration. I hung up and called back, begging for a supervisor. Another 30 minutes on hold. Lucas started having seizures. Tiny, horrible twitches. His whole body, not even 2 pounds, just convulsing. Mrs. Miles walked over. Sir, if you continue to be disruptive, I'll have to ask you to leave. My babies are dying. Your babies are stable. They're receiving basic support. Stable? I showed her the monitors. This is stable to you? She looked at her tablet. According to our metrics, they're within acceptable parameters for their condition. Dr. Kim couldn't take it anymore. Margaret, for God's sake, those parameters are for adults. These are 28-week preemies. They need surfactant therapy now, or their lungs will collapse permanently. She turned to him coldly. Dr. Kim, you're speaking outside your authority. Should I report this to the chief? Over an hour had passed. My boys were now on maximum oxygen support, but still failing. Other doctors kept walking by, looking in, shaking their heads. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone was watching 2 babies die because of paperwork. A janitor, an older man, pulled me aside. My granddaughter died here last year. Same thing. Insurance authorization. There's an ambulance bay out back. Sometimes the keys are in them. I didn't even think. I kissed my unconscious wife's forehead and ran. The ambulance keys were there. My hands were steady now, pure adrenaline and rage. I drove it right up to the emergency entrance, ran in past security, who were too shocked to stop me. Dr. Kim saw me and understood immediately. He grabbed both incubators. I didn't see anything, he said loudly, then whispered, Children's Hospital, 12 blocks north. I'm calling ahead. Mrs. Miles came running. Stop! This is theft. This is kidnapping. I looked her dead in the eyes while Dr. Kim loaded my boys. Sue me. Arrest me. I don't care anymore. You're destroying your life, she screamed. You'll go to prison. You'll lose everything. I'm about to lose everything anyway. Security guards appeared, but Dr. Kim stepped between us. Gentlemen, please help me with these incubators. These babies are in distress. Mrs. Miles. Don't you dare. You're all witnesses to a crime. An older security guard looked at the babies, then at her. I don't see anything, ma'am. I'm on my break. He walked away. The other guard followed. I drove those 12 blocks faster than I've ever driven anything. No sirens. I didn't know how to work them. Just me, weaving through traffic, while Dr. Kim sat in the back manually ventilating Ethan because his lungs had fully collapsed. The hospital entrance came up fast and I slammed on the brakes so hard the tires screamed. Dr. Kim was already moving before we fully stopped, jumping out the back doors, still squeezing that bag to keep air going into Ethan's tiny lungs. I grabbed Lucas's incubator and ran after him. The automatic doors opened and nurses in the emergency area looked up from what they were doing. One of them saw the incubators and Dr. Kim working the bag and started yelling for help. More people came running from everywhere. They didn't ask questions or check paperwork or anything. They just grabbed my boys and rushed them through another set of doors. A woman in blue scrubs took over from Dr. Kim and started calling out medical stuff I didn't understand while they pushed both incubators down a hallway. Dr. Kim put his hand on my shoulder for a second before following them. My legs were shaking, so bad I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Everything hit me at once. The stealing an ambulance, leaving my wife alone in a coma, my boys may be dying. A security guard came over asking about the ambulance blocking the emergency entrance. Dr. Kim came back out and told him it was an authorized critical transport. The guard looked at me, then at Dr. Kim, then just asked if someone could move it to the parking lot. Another guard said he'd do it when he saw I could barely stand up straight. They helped me to a chair and someone brought me water. That's when it hit me that my wife was still at the other hospital, unconscious and alone. I'd left her there. The thought made my chest hurt. How do you choose between your dying babies and your wife, who might never wake up? A nurse saw me starting to lose it and sat down next to me. She didn't say anything, just handed me tissues. About an hour later, a doctor came out. She introduced herself as Dr. Frances Steele, the lead neonatologist. She said they'd gotten tubes down both boys' throats and given them surfactant to help their lungs work. Lucas was still having seizures, but they were trying different medications. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She said the next 48 hours would be critical. Both boys had grade 2 brain bleeds from being so early and the lack of oxygen. But they had a chance now. A real chance. The hospital administrator showed up with a stack of papers. She was nothing like Mrs. Miles. She said they'd already started treatment and would figure out the insurance stuff later. I signed everything she put in front of me. My hands were shaking, so much I could barely hold the pen. She said not to worry about the bills right now, just focus on the boys. A nurse came to get me and showed me how to wash my hands and arms the special way for the NICU. The soap smelled weird, and she made me scrub for 3 whole minutes. Then she gave me a gown and took me to see them. They looked so small in those plastic boxes, wires and tubes everywhere, machines beeping. The nurse explained what everything was. The blue light for jaundice, the breathing tube, the feeding tube, all the monitors tracking their hearts and oxygen. She showed me the normal numbers to look for. I tried to remember, but my brain felt broken. I called my parents from the waiting room. The words came out all wrong. I kept jumping around, trying to explain about the early birth and the coma and stealing the ambulance. My mom kept saying they were coming right now. I heard my dad in the background already getting the car keys. Then I called my wife's sister. She started crying when I told her. She said she'd be there in 2 hours. That evening, 2 cops showed up wanting to talk about the ambulance. Dr. Kim was there and explained about the medical emergency. They took notes and said someone would be in touch, but they seemed to understand. One of them had a premature kid himself years ago. They said they had to file a report, but it didn't sound like they wanted to arrest me or anything. The next morning, I was sleeping in a chair next to the incubators when someone woke me up. Dinah Lambert from Child Protective Services. She said the situation with the ambulance and everything triggered an automatic review. She seemed nice enough, but said she had to investigate to make sure the twins would be safe with me. She asked a bunch of questions about our home and support system. I answered everything while watching my boys' monitors, making sure the numbers stayed where they should be. She kept asking about our income and if we had family nearby while Lucas started shaking again in his incubator. The nurse rushed over and pushed something into his IV line while I watched his tiny body jerk and twitch. This was the 3rd medicine they'd tried, and it wasn't working either. Dr. Steele came over and watched the monitor for a few minutes before the shaking finally stopped. She told me it was still a small win since the seizures were shorter now. Ethan was doing better on the breathing machine, but still needed help with every breath. I signed whatever papers Dinah needed while trying to memorize all the numbers on the screens. The next few days blurred together as I learned how the NICU worked. Nurses changed shifts at 7 in the morning and 7 at night. Doctors did their rounds at 9. Some alarms meant drop everything and run. Others just meant a wire came loose. A nurse named Beth showed me how to change their diapers through the little doors in the incubators. The diapers were so small they fit in my palm. She taught me how to touch them gently so they knew I was there. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Kim asking if he could know how they were doing. I took a picture of both monitors showing their heart rates and oxygen levels staying steady. He texted back a thumbs up, but I knew what this was costing him. On day 3, they wheeled Lucas away for a brain scan. When they brought him back, Dr. Steele pulled me aside to show me the images on her computer. There was bleeding in his brain, but she said it was grade 2, which meant it might heal on its own. Ethan's lungs were getting a bit better, but his heart kept slowing down every few hours. The nurses would rub his back or feet to remind him to keep his heart beating right. Every good thing came with something bad. The billing office called me that afternoon, and the woman said they were using emergency rules to bypass the insurance delays. She said the big hospital was demanding answers from the insurance company, and suddenly they were being helpful. It was crazy how different things were when you already had the treatment, instead of begging for it. I hadn't seen my wife in 3 days, so I drove back to the first hospital. The nurses at her floor wouldn't look at me when I walked by. I sat with her for an hour holding her hand while she stayed unconscious. The machines kept beeping and breathing for her. When I was leaving, an administrator stopped me in the hallway and mentioned they might press charges for the ambulance thing. I left before I said something stupid. The next morning, a man in a suit showed up at the NICU asking for me. His name was Galen Woodward, and he said he was a lawyer who wanted to help for free. He sat me down and listed what they could charge me with. Grand theft for taking the ambulance, kidnapping for taking the babies without permission, breaking and entering even though I just walked in. My stomach felt sick as he talked, but then he said we had good defenses for everything. He said any jury would understand why I did it. 2 days later, I got a call from someone named Kenneth Hardy, who worked for the state health department. He was mad about what happened and wanted to investigate the hospital. He asked for everything I could remember. Names of people who saw it. Exactly what time things happened. If anyone took videos. He sounded like he really wanted to nail them for what they did. That same day, I found out the first hospital had reported Dr. Kim to the medical board. They said he helped me kidnap the babies. He was suspended while they investigated. Galen told me not to say anything publicly about it, even though I wanted to scream about how wrong it was. Dr. Kim saved my boys' lives, and now he might lose his license for it. 2 weeks passed, with me living in that NICU. I knew every nurse by name, and which vending machines had the best coffee. Lucas hadn't had a seizure in 3 days. Ethan was still on the breathing machine, but needing less help. Then my phone rang, and it was my wife's sister crying. My wife was awake. I ran to my car and drove back to the first hospital. She was sitting up in bed looking confused and weak. The first thing she asked was if the babies were okay. I showed her pictures on my phone of them in their incubators. She kept swiping through every photo I had taken. I tried to explain what the doctors said about her heart condition, how she almost died when the boys were born, how she had something called pulmonary hypertension that nobody caught during the pregnancy. She just kept asking to see more pictures of Lucas and Ethan. She wanted to know everything about them, how much they weighed now, if they were eating, when she could see them. The doctor came in and explained she'd need to stay in the hospital for at least another week. Her heart was damaged and she needed medicine to help it work. She'd need oxygen at home for a while, no more pregnancies ever because it would kill her. She took it all in but kept going back to the photos of the boys on my phone. 3 weeks later, I stood in the courthouse wearing my only suit while Galen explained what would happen at my arraignment. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood panels and fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. The judge came in and everyone stood up, which felt weird since I'd only seen that in movies. The prosecutor, Louis Gerard, was a tall guy with gray hair who kept looking at his notes instead of at me. When the judge read the charges out loud, it sounded worse than I thought. Grand theft of an emergency vehicle valued at over $100,000. 2 counts of kidnapping for taking the twins without discharge papers. The judge asked how I wanted to plead, and Galen said not guilty, which made my stomach twist. Louis Gerard stood up and started talking about how I wasn't a flight risk and had no criminal record. He actually said the circumstances were unusual, and he wasn't asking for jail time right now. The judge looked at me over his glasses and said I was released on my own recognizance. He ordered me not to leave the state and to stay away from the original hospital completely. The whole thing took 20 minutes, and then I was walking out into the sunlight, feeling like I might throw up. That afternoon, Dr. Steele asked to meet with both of us in a small conference room at Children's Hospital. My wife was in a wheelchair with her oxygen tank, and I could see her hands shaking a little. Dr. Steele pulled out charts and brain scans and started explaining what we were looking at for the future. The boys would probably be in the NICU for at least 3 more months, maybe 4. They might have vision problems from all the oxygen they needed to survive. Learning disabilities were likely, and we'd need early intervention services starting basically right away. She showed us statistics about 28-week preemies and developmental delays, but said every baby was different. My wife kept nodding and taking notes while I just sat there trying to process that our boys might never be normal. Dr. Steele wasn't trying to scare us, but she wanted us to understand the road ahead would be long. 2 days later, the insurance company called, and Galen had me put it on speaker in his office. They were offering partial retroactive authorization, which meant they'd cover about 60% of the costs. The woman on the phone acted like she was doing us a huge favor, but 60% still left us with hundreds of thousands in bills. Galen's wife, Constance, came in halfway through the call and started taking notes about appeal deadlines and documentation requirements. She said she'd handled cases like this before, and we had options, but it would take months of fighting. After the call, I just sat there doing math in my head about how many years it would take to pay everything off. The next morning, Dinah Lambert from CPS called to schedule our home inspection for the following week. She needed to verify we had appropriate space for medically fragile infants, even though the boys wouldn't be home for months. I spent the next 3 days installing cabinet locks and outlet covers and cleaning everything twice. I bought a fire extinguisher and carbon monoxide detectors and made sure all the smoke alarms worked. I even fixed the loose railing on the stairs that had been wobbly for 2 years. My wife watched me from the couch, still too weak to help much, but giving suggestions about what else to baby-proof. Scott Henderson, the reporter, started calling every day, leaving messages about wanting to tell our story. He said videos from other parents in that waiting room were going viral, and people wanted to know what happened to us. Galen told me not to talk to anyone about anything until the criminal case was over. It was hard not to call him back when I wanted everyone to know what that hospital did to us. But Galen said public sympathy wouldn't help if I said something the prosecutor could use against me. A week after my wife came home, we had our first real fight since everything started. She was sitting in bed, looking at photos, when she suddenly asked why I didn't wait for her to wake up. Why I made such a huge decision about stealing the ambulance without talking to her first. I tried to explain that the boys were dying and there wasn't time, but she started crying, saying I left her alone. She woke up and I was gone and the babies were gone, and nobody would tell her anything for hours. I understood why she was mad, but I told her I'd do the exact same thing again if I had to. We both ended up crying and holding each other, agreeing we were just scared and exhausted and taking it out on each other. The next day brought more bad news when Ethan's head ultrasound results came back. Dr. Steele showed us the images pointing to dark spots that meant grade 2 brain bleeds, just like his brother. She explained this could mean developmental delays, but not necessarily severe disability, and we'd have to wait and see. My wife grabbed my hand so tight it hurt while Dr. Steele talked about early intervention and physical therapy. We clung to the words not necessarily severe, like they were the only thing keeping us afloat. Galen called that night to remind me again about not talking to reporters or posting anything online. He said public sympathy was definitely on our side, but any statement I made could give the prosecution ammunition. It was so frustrating to stay quiet when I wanted to scream from the rooftops about what happened. Then I heard through the NICU nurses that Dr. Kim was facing a termination hearing next month for helping us. Other doctors at Children's Hospital were quietly writing letters supporting him and talking about his character. I wrote one too, but Galen had to review it first to make sure I didn't accidentally admit to anything that could hurt my case. The letter took me 3 drafts to get right, without mentioning specific details about that day. 2 days later, Constance called to say the original hospital's lawyers had reached out about a potential settlement. They wanted to make everything go away quietly with a non-disclosure agreement attached. The offer was insulting, barely enough to cover 1 month of NICU bills, but Constance said it showed they were worried about something. She told us not to respond yet, while she figured out what they were really afraid of. The next morning, my wife's cardiologist came to her room with a thick folder and started explaining everything. She couldn't have any more kids, because another pregnancy would kill her. She'd need 3 different heart medications every day for the rest of her life, monthly checkups to monitor her heart function, maybe surgery in a few years if things got worse. I sat there watching her face while he talked, waiting for her to break down, but she just nodded and asked practical questions about the medications. When he left, she squeezed my hand and said, at least she was alive to need all this treatment, which made me want to cry more than if she'd actually cried. 3 days later, Dinah Lambert from CPS showed up at our apartment with another social worker carrying a clipboard. They walked through every room, measuring windows and checking locks on cabinets we didn't even use yet. They tested all 4 smoke detectors and made me show them where we kept the fire extinguisher. The other social worker took photos of the empty nursery we'd set up months ago when everything was still normal. Dinah asked about our support system, and I listed my parents and my wife's sister who'd been taking turns staying with us. They seemed satisfied with everything, but said they'd need to keep checking until the criminal case was done. That night, around 2 in the morning, Lucas's monitor started screaming, and 3 nurses rushed into his NICU pod. His oxygen levels had dropped to 60, and he was turning that awful blue color again. I stood there frozen while they worked, adjusting his ventilator settings and suctioning his breathing tube. One nurse grabbed an ambu bag and started squeezing air into him manually, while another adjusted medications. The head nurse turned to me and put the bag in my hands, showing me how to squeeze it at the right rhythm. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it, but I learned because what else could I do? 20 minutes later, his color came back and they got him stable again, but the nurse made me practice with the bag 3 more times, so I'd know what to do if it happened when fewer staff were around. The next afternoon, Galen called to say Louis, Gerard, the district attorney, wanted to meet about a deal. We sat in a conference room at the courthouse while Gerard explained the diversion program. 200 hours of community service at the hospital, $5,000 to pay for the ambulance I took, and all charges would be dropped after 2 years of probation. No felony record, no jail time. Galen leaned over and whispered this was better than we could have hoped for given everything. My wife grabbed my hand under the table and nodded, so I said yes, even though part of me wanted to fight it on principle. That same week, Scott Henderson's article came out in the paper and online. He'd used the videos from other parents' phones and public records from the state investigation. The headline read, Hospital delays life-saving treatment for dying newborns over insurance. Within hours, it was everywhere. My phone blew up with texts from people I hadn't talked to in years. Mrs. Miles's name started trending on Twitter with people calling her things I can't repeat. Someone found her LinkedIn, and her photo became a meme about heartless bureaucracy. The hospital's Facebook page got thousands of angry comments before they shut it down. 2 days later, we heard through the NICU nurses that Mrs. Miles had been placed on administrative leave while the state investigated. The hospital put out a statement about reviewing their emergency protocols and ensuring patient care came first, but they never admitted doing anything wrong. It didn't feel like justice, just the system protecting itself by throwing one person under the bus while keeping the same broken policies. A week later, I was getting coffee in the hospital cafeteria when I saw Dr. Kim at a corner table. He looked tired, older somehow, but he smiled when he saw me. We shook hands and sat down without saying much at first. He told me he'd gotten the reprimand but kept his license and found a position at a smaller hospital across town. I started to thank him, but he just shook his head and said he'd make the same choice again. We both knew what we'd risked and what we'd gained. Neither of us needed to say more. The best day came when my wife finally got medical clearance to visit the NICU 3 weeks after waking up. She had to use a wheelchair and bring her oxygen tank, but she was there. I watched her reach through the incubator ports to touch Lucas and Ethan for the first time since they were born. Her fingers traced their tiny faces while she whispered promises about coming home soon and being a family. Tears ran down her face and mine too. The nurse pretended not to notice and gave us extra time before rounds. The next week brought the insurance letter we'd been dreading. They'd approved more coverage but capped it at $600,000 total. We were still looking at over $200,000 in bills they wouldn't cover. The financial counselor at Children's Hospital sat us down with a stack of papers showing payment plans that would take 30 years to pay off. She tried to make it sound manageable, talking about monthly minimums and interest rates, but we both knew we'd be paying for this until the boys went to college. The next day, the same counselor called us back with information about the hospital's financial assistance program. We had to prove we were broke, which meant gathering 3 months of bank statements, pay stubs, tax returns, and a letter from my employer about my unpaid leave. It was humiliating laying out our finances for strangers, showing how we'd already drained our savings and maxed out credit cards, but pride was something we couldn't afford anymore. The eye doctor came to the NICU the next week to check both boys for something called retinopathy of prematurity. She dilated their tiny pupils and used this special lens to look at the back of their eyes while they screamed. The results showed they were both at risk and might need laser surgery if it got worse. Dr. Steele explained it was common in preemies, but hearing the word blindness on top of everything else made my chest tight. 3 days later, Lucas's heart monitor started going crazy during his morning feed. The cardiologist did an echo and found a PDA, which meant a valve in his heart wasn't closing right. They wanted to try medication first before talking about surgery. We signed the consent forms because what else could we do? Every choice was just picking the least bad option from a menu of terrible things. That same afternoon, Galen called to say Louis Girard had formally offered the plea deal. Misdemeanor charges, 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and $5,000 to pay for the ambulance. Galen said we should take it because it meant no felonies and we could focus on the boys. My wife agreed from her hospital bed, so I told him yes, even though it felt like admitting I did something wrong when all I did was save my kids. A civil rights group contacted us through email saying they'd heard about our case and wanted to help file complaints against the original hospital. They'd handled dozens of cases like ours where insurance delays hurt people. We spent the whole next day going through everything with their lawyers while the boys slept between feeds, writing down every detail we could remember. Scott Henderson reached out through Facebook saying he'd found 3 other families with similar stories about insurance authorization delays. One family's baby died waiting for approval. We did a video call with all of them, everyone sharing their anger about a system that cared more about paperwork than babies. The mom who lost her daughter couldn't stop crying and kept saying she wished she'd been brave enough to steal an ambulance too. Kenneth Hardy from the state investigation called needing all our records and recordings for his case against the hospital. We spent that whole weekend sorting through papers and making a timeline of everything that happened. My wife had to keep stopping to go to the bathroom and cry when we got to the parts about the boys turning blue. She was trying to be strong, but reading those medical notes brought it all back. Monday morning, my wife woke up coughing and couldn't catch her breath. The doctors found fluid in her lungs and said she needed to be admitted again. For 3 days, I was back to running between 2 hospitals, and the worst part was she had to go back to the same place that almost let our boys die. The nurses there wouldn't look me in the eye, and everyone acted like they didn't know who we were. Our insurance finally approved a therapist who specialized in medical trauma, and we had our first session that Thursday. She had us talk about what we were feeling instead of just pushing through each day. I told her I was ready to die that day, if it meant saving the boys, and my wife grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. The therapist said that was normal for parents in crisis, but we needed to process it or it would eat us alive. 2 weeks later, the eye doctor said Ethan's condition had gotten worse to stage 3, and he needed laser surgery. The surgeon was confident, but warned us he might lose some side vision. We signed more papers and added another specialist to our list of doctors. The surgery took an hour, and Ethan came back with patches on his eyes that made him look even smaller. After 10 weeks on the ventilator, they finally tried moving Ethan to CPAP, which meant he could breathe more on his own. Watching them pull out that breathing tube and seeing his whole face without tape for the first time made him suddenly real in a different way. He had my dad's eyes and my wife's nose, and we both just stared at him like we were seeing him for the first time. The CPAP mask still covered his nose, but at least we could see his mouth move when he cried. Lucas was still on the ventilator, and seeing Ethan without all the tape made us realize how much of Lucas's face we'd never really seen. The nurses kept telling us it was good progress, but it felt like we were climbing a mountain that kept getting taller. Every week brought new problems and new decisions and new forms to sign. The bills kept coming too, each one bigger than the last, but we just put them in a box because what else could we do? My boss called to check in and said they couldn't hold my position much longer without me coming back at least part-time. I told him I'd try to figure something out, but honestly, I didn't know how I could leave the boys even for a few hours. My wife was getting stronger but still needed oxygen and got tired just walking to the NICU. We were living day by day, feed by feed, alarm by alarm, just trying to keep everyone alive and moving forward. My parents drove down that weekend to talk about the plea deal Galen had worked out with Louis Gerard. We sat around the kitchen table while my wife held the papers with shaking hands. My dad kept saying I should fight it on principle because I saved my boys' lives. My mom agreed and said any jury would understand what I did, but my wife looked at them both and reminded them we needed this to be over. She couldn't handle months of trial while the boys were still so sick. I watched her struggling to breathe even with the oxygen tube and knew she was right. We signed the papers accepting the deal that night. Court day came 3 weeks later, and I wore my only suit that still fit after losing 30 pounds from stress. The courtroom was packed with people who'd been following our story online. I stood when the judge asked how I pleaded and said no contest to the misdemeanor charges. The judge gave me 2 years probation and 200 hours of community service. He added that he hoped Kenneth Hardy's state investigation would bring real accountability to the hospital. Walking out of that courthouse without handcuffs felt like winning the lottery. Kenneth called me the next week to say his investigation found 12 major violations at the original hospital. They had to revise all their emergency protocols and retrain every administrator on staff. The state fined them $500,000. It wasn't enough for what they did, but at least other families might not go through our hell. Dr. Kim sent a card saying he got a formal reprimand from the medical board, but kept his license. He took a job at a smaller hospital 2 hours away with less money and prestige. His note said he was actually happier there because they let him practice real medicine. The day of Ethan's eye surgery, I threw up twice from nerves. The surgeon took 3 hours using lasers to stop the bad blood vessels from growing. When he came out, he said Ethan would probably lose some side vision, but should see fine otherwise. My wife and I held each other in that waiting room and cried because partial vision was so much better than blind. 2 days later, Francis called with more good news about Lucas. The medication was working, and his PDA valve was closing on its own. No surgery needed. We celebrated with terrible hospital coffee and exhausted smiles in the NICU break room. These tiny victories kept us from losing our minds completely. My wife finally got discharged after 14 weeks in and out of the hospital. She came home with a portable oxygen tank and 12 different medications. Our bedroom looked like a medical supply store with all her equipment. She spent every day next to me at the NICU, learning how to work the monitors and give medications for when the boys came home. The consolidated medical bill came in a thick envelope that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. $400,000 after insurance paid their part. Constance helped us fill out 20 different assistance applications. She said we'd be paying it off for decades, but at least the boys were alive to be expensive. Scott Henderson wrote another article about our story that went viral. Some local business owner read it and started a fundraiser for us. Complete strangers sent money and shared their own horror stories about insurance companies. In 2 weeks, they raised $50,000. I cried reading the messages from people who understood what we went through. Week 16 finally came, and Francis said Ethan met all his discharge requirements. He still needed oxygen and heart monitors, but he was stable enough to go home. The NICU nurses threw him a tiny graduation party with a cap made from a medicine cup and a certificate they all signed. One nurse who'd been there since day one hugged me and said she'd never forget our family. I packed up 16 weeks of accumulated stuff from his corner of the NICU while my wife held him without any wires for the first time. The drive home took forever because I went 20 miles under the speed limit, terrified of crashing with him in the car. We had to stop twice so my wife could check that he was still breathing, even though his monitor showed he was fine. Our living room had been transformed into a mini hospital with his oxygen concentrator and apnea monitor and feeding pump. The home health nurse spent 4 hours teaching us how to use everything. That first night, the alarms went off every hour, and neither of us slept. My wife kept checking his color while I adjusted oxygen tubes that got tangled every time he moved. By morning, we were zombies, but Ethan was still breathing, and that was all that mattered. Lucas stayed in the NICU 2 more weeks before he was ready. His graduation felt even more special, because we knew our family would finally be complete at home. The nurses cried when we left with both boys after 18 weeks of living in that NICU. Frances hugged us and said to call her anytime we were worried. She'd saved our boys when another hospital would have let them die for paperwork. Driving away from Children's Hospital with both boys in the back seat felt like the end of one nightmare and the start of a different challenge. That first night home with Ethan was pure chaos. The oxygen concentrator hummed so loud we couldn't hear the TV, and every time he moved, the pulse ox alarm screamed because the sensor slipped off his tiny foot. My wife took the first shift while I tried to sleep, but I kept jumping up every time I heard beeping. Around 2 in the morning, his feeding tube got tangled with the oxygen line, and we spent 20 minutes trying to sort it out without waking him. The home health nurse had shown us the setup 3 times, but doing it ourselves in the dark while exhausted was completely different. By 4, we'd given up on shifts and just sat together on the couch, taking turns holding the oxygen mask in place when he pulled at it. The sun came up and we looked like zombies, but his monitor showed steady numbers, and that's all that mattered. 3 days later, we had our first couples therapy appointment. The therapist asked us to talk about what we'd been through without blaming each other, which was harder than it sounds. My wife admitted she was mad I made the ambulance decision without her, even though she knew I had no choice. I told her I felt guilty every day that I couldn't be with her when she almost died because I was saving the boys. We both cried a lot that first session. The therapist gave us homework to write letters to each other about what we appreciated during the crisis. It felt stupid at first, but writing down how brave she was learning all the medical stuff while recovering from heart failure helped me see her differently. 2 weeks became 4 weeks became 12 weeks of therapy, learning to talk instead of just taking turns breaking down. Week 18 finally came, and Lucas got discharged. No oxygen needed, just weekly physical therapy for his muscle tone and occupational therapy for feeding issues. The NICU nurses cried when we left, and Frances pulled us aside to say she'd never forget our family. Loading both boys in the car felt unreal. Our living room looked like a medical supply warehouse with 2 cribs, monitors, oxygen tanks, feeding pumps, and boxes of supplies stacked everywhere. That first night with both boys home, neither of us slept at all. One would cry and wake the other, then they'd both need changing, then feeding, then meds. We figured out a system where I handled Lucas while my wife managed Ethan's more complex needs. Constance called about the settlement offer from the original hospital. They'd gone up to $75,000 with a strict NDA about the amount. She said we could push for more, but it would mean going to trial, which could take years. We took it. The check came 2 weeks later, and we immediately put it toward the boys' therapy bills. Signing that NDA felt like letting them win, but we needed the money more than we needed justice. One afternoon, I drove past the original hospital on my way to pick up prescriptions. I'd written a thank you card for the janitor who told me about the ambulance. No name, no signature, just thank you for saving my boys' lives that day. I left it at the information desk addressed to the custodial staff and hoped he'd know it was from me. Without him, both boys would be dead. 6 months after everything, Dr. Kim texted asking if I wanted to grab coffee. We met at a place near his new hospital, smaller than the original, but he seemed happier. He told me they actually let him practice medicine there instead of worrying about liability all the time. We didn't really talk about that day much, just caught up on the boy's progress and his new position. He showed me pictures of his own kids, and we talked about normal dad stuff like sleep deprivation and diaper brands. When we left, he shook my hand and said he was glad he was there that day. I started keeping a journal to process everything. Late at night after the boys were asleep, I'd write down memories from the NICU. The fear when they turned blue, the rage at Mrs. Miles, the relief when Frances took over their care. Some entries were just lists of medical terms I'd learned or milestone dates. Others were long rambling pages about how the system almost killed my family for paperwork. I figured maybe someday the boys would want to know their story, the real version, not the sanitized one we'd tell at birthday parties. 8 months after that terrifying day, both boys were hitting their adjusted milestones. Lucas could hold his head up and was starting to roll over. Ethan still needed overnight oxygen, but only when sleeping. We owed $300,000 after all the insurance battles and assistance programs, with payment plans stretching 20 years into the future. My wife took her 12 medications every day and had monthly cardiology appointments. The original hospital had supposedly implemented new emergency protocols, though I doubted much had really changed. Kenneth Hardy's investigation led to some fines and mandatory retraining, but Mrs. Miles still worked there, just in a different department. The boys' therapist said they were doing remarkably well considering their start. We were drowning financially, but keeping our heads just above water, and that was enough because we were all here, all alive, all together. Thanks for exploring all these questions with me today. It's been a pretty curious little journey to share together. Until next time, take care. Subscribe for more content like this.